welcome to another video from Colour with Claire. So today I'm experimenting a little bit and taking a look at the differences between types of paint, namely watercolour, acrylic, gouache and tempera. So I'm a real beginner when it comes to paint and I've got no idea what the different features of each type are or how they perform on paper. So I thought we'd give it a go together and see what happens. Now these boxes, going to insert a picture here because I can't fit them all on screen. These were generously sent to me by Arteza, who have a huge range of paints and art supplies on their website, but this isn't a sponsored video or anything like that. I just want to know once and for all basically what the different paints actually do. So first of all, I'm going to take you through each box so that you can see what you'd be getting if you are on the lookout for some new paints and considering buying these Arteza ones. Links for everything in this video will be in the description box below. All the paints I'm going to show you today come in smaller sets, and this is the current maximum available. So first up we have Watercolor Paint. So the paints come in this beautiful box, very high quality, really nice packaging, and you can see that this is the 60 set. On the top here we have the colour chart of all the different colours that you're getting in the set. They have plus signs for light fastness. They've got transparency logos there so you can see how transparent they are, and then you've also got the pigment numbers as well. On the other side is just a little bit of info about Arteza and some QR codes there for helpful watercolour tips. And then you open the box, lifts up like this, and you're presented with the tubes of watercolour. So you can see that they come in these little plastic inserts which hold 6 tubes in each. So I'm just going to remove these so that you can see what they all look like. So we've got all of these different inserts. This is actually a really good idea if there's a combination of colours that you use most often, because you can keep those that combination together in one of these inserts, and it's easy to just pick out and take with you. So you can see all of the inserts down to the bottom, and they're just easy to take out and replace. So the colours, really extensive. You've got 60 different colours here, and they're all kind of put into groups. So you've got your blues, you've got some really light browns here. We've got a mixture of what look like they could be skin tones. We've got some greens and yellows here, and we've got some reds, lilacs and kind of sienna browns there. So they're all kind of put together in these little sections. Now the tubes themselves look like this. So it says Arteza Watercolours Premium. There's 12 mils in every single tube. It tells you the name of the colour at the top, its light fastness, its transparency, its pigment name and its number, the colour number from Arteza. Then on the back you've got the Arteza address, American company, designed in the USA, conforms to those different things there, and then a guarantee that they will replace it if it doesn't perform properly or if it's damaged or anything like that. So usual size for a tube of paint. It looks really professional. You open it up and it's already open there for you. You can see I've just squeezed a little out, so you don't have to puncture it or anything like that. And that is the watercolours. So I'll put those to one side. Move on to the gouache. Just move these out of the way. So exactly the same kind of box, a little bit of a different design on the front so that you know which is which, but again 60 colours, colour chart on the top. Open it up and we've got all of those different little sections and lift out pieces again. Really looks exactly the same as the watercolours. You just have to be careful that you read the label and you know which ones that you're using, but again all the information is the same. You open it up, it's all the same. So the production quality of all of this kind of packaging wise is absolutely stunning really. It's a gorgeous way to set all of the paints out, and the box is a wonderful storage system. Same again with the acrylic paints. This is a slightly larger box. It still contains 60 colours. You've still got your colour chart on the top there, and these paints, the difference is that the tubes are a little bit bigger. So you've got 22 mils here instead of the 12 that you had in the previous two paints. Again, all your info at the top. Everything is exactly the same. all laid out in these inserts. You just, as I say, have to be careful and look at exactly what paint you're using. Obviously these being bigger, you would know straight away that they're the acrylics, but with the gouache and the watercolours, you might have to just take a look at those and make sure you've got the right paint. So that's the acrylics. Finally, we have, just give me a second because this is really heavy. This is the Tempera Paint. So trying to get it all on camera, but there's actually just 16 paints in this one. They're labelled as Arteza Kids, they're washable and non-toxic, and there are 16 colours. So this box opens a little bit differently, and it's got a completely different insert, as you can see. So the 16 colours, actually in these huge bottles of 400 ml. So you can see there, it's got the Arteza name, Tempera colours, black A104. There's no light fastness or anything like that. These are much cheaper, much more kind of kiddie paints, so they don't have any kind of light fast or transparency ratings or anything like that, and they come in these big bottles that you can use loads at a time. And we've got some beautiful colours in here. We've got the standard colours, then you've also got silver metallic, you've got gold metallic, then you've got a silver glitter, and it's actually glow in the dark as well, and a gold glitter. So you've also got a set here of your fluorescent colours, and then your usual bog standard white, black, brown, purple, orange, yellow, blue and green, so you can mix all of those up. Just looking at this, yeah, this is actually red. It looked just like orange when I was looking at the colour then. So you have got red, you can mix them all and create new colours and everything like that. So that, in essence, is what all of the boxes look like. So now that we've seen what's in all of these, I'm going to tell you what I've found out about all of these different paints by doing a trusty Google search, and then we'll physically try all of them out and I can give you my opinion, albeit a very, very amateur one. So I'm just going to put a few of these boxes on screen so you've got something to look at while I'm talking at you. So we've got the acrylic, we've got the gouache, we've got the watercolour. Okay, so the first difference that I found, sorry, I'm just trying to make sure that the Tempera paint doesn't fall off the desk. It is so heavy. I'm going to put it behind me on the shelf, so just bear with me. Right, it's on the shelf now. Okay, the first difference that I've found is that watercolour paints are transparent, so they allow you to layer them up, whereas gouache, acrylic and the tempera are opaque, meaning that they're going to cover up the surface that you paint them onto and you won't be able to see anything underneath unless, of course, you add tons of water to thin them right down to a kind of wash. Now the paints are all water-based, meaning that if they get wet at any stage, even when your piece is dry, they could get ruined. Apart from the acrylic, which has more permanency than the others, it dries with a kind of plasticky, glossy finish, and it's waterproof. Another thing is the quality. So watercolour, gouache and acrylic are commonly used by skilled artists to create really long-lasting artwork, whereas the tempera paint, I don't know how you say it, tempera, aka poster paint, is much cheaper, it's a much thicker medium, and it's mainly used by kids or to paint temporary things that's going to be thrown away after use, like backdrop scenery in school plays. It dries chalky rather than glossy, and part of its makeup is actually egg yolk, so you may find that the tempera paint has more of a funky odour than the others. They're super washable, the tempera paint, and they're non-toxic, which is why they're the first choice for finger painting and things like that in kindergarten. So watercolour paints are very light and they require you to build up the colour, whereas the other paint types give you bold, vibrant colour straight off the bat. This makes watercolour more of a nuanced medium that you really have to learn how to use properly rather than just grabbing your brush and diving straight in. Watercolour is known to be a difficult skill to master. The techniques need time and practice, whereas the other types of paint are more forgiving, especially if you're a beginner like me. So gouache is probably the best choice for a starter paint before you get into watercolour, because it's the closest relative. Basically, gouache is an opaque watercolour, so it's much more vivid and pigmented. If you think of it like this, watercolour is mainly water with a tint of colour, whereas gouache is much more colour with less water. With gouache, I think you get the best of both worlds because you can keep it really thick or you can thin it right down to the watercolour. Both gouache and watercolour only really work on paper though, whereas the tempera and the acrylic can be used on plenty of different surfaces. Now, if watercolour requires lots of time and layering the translucent colour, then acrylic is its counterpart in that it's very quick and bright right from the outset. You need use little to no water with acrylic paint, depending on the look that you're going for. You can paint with acrylics on almost any surface. They can't be reworked later, so you've got to make sure that each stroke is where you want it to be. They are quite similar to oil paints in that sense, but they dry much, much faster. You can also add loads of different mediums available to buy, which will change the consistency, the glossiness, the transparency, and some other properties of acrylic paint if you wish. So they're quite versatile in that way. So now that we've got through all of that, hopefully you're a little bit more clued up on the fundamental differences between each type of paint. Let's have a go with the paints now and see what my first impressions are of how they lay down, how they mix, and how they dry on paper. Okay, so let's have a look at the watercolours first of all, the scariest of all the mediums, to me anyway, because they seem to take a lot of practice and learning to use. So I'm just going to grab, let's grab crimson, because that's quite a dark colour and I want to see how sort of the colour builds up. So I'm going to pop a little bit here onto my palette, which is just a plate, in case you're wondering. And I've got some water here in my son's Toy Story mug that he doesn't use anymore, so it's become my water receptacle. And I'm going to add a little bit of paint to this first of all. Sorry, not paint, water. Add a bit of water first of all and see what happens. So you can see straight away that's really, really vivid. And let's see how it looks on paper. Now I'm using special watercolour paper because watercolours will not work on standard, bog-standard kind of printer paper. So I've got some watercolour paper here. Now let's do a little swatch and see what happens. So that is actually really nicely pigmented actually. I think these are quite good quality. I've not tried too many watercolours, but you can see straight away that you get a really smooth wash of colour from that. And then you can add in a bit more paint and make it darker. And of course you can add more water to really lighten it up to a wash. So that's what I'm going to do now, just add a bit more water, see how light we can get this colour. There we go. So you can see it's super, just very tinted there, really light. So you're getting kind of different levels of colour depending on how much water you use. And of course these can be reworked when they've dried, so if you want to change them about a little bit you can do that. But I just think I was actually expecting them to be a lot paler than that on first go, so I'm really impressed with how the watercolours come out so far. Let's try another colour and see if we can blend them together. So we've got a crimson there. Let's try this vermilion, because that's more of an orange, and hopefully they'll blend quite nicely together. So you can see I'm just putting a little bit there. You don't need a lot at all. You can see how much colour I've got left just by dabbing that little bit of paint on there. So you don't need a lot. So it probably will last quite a long time. So I'm going to lift this paint out first of all. Let's do a little wash of that. Really beautiful, beautiful colours, very vibrant. And now I'm just going to mix it with this crimson and see what we achieve blending wise. So they look to be blending really nicely together. There's no weird kind of residue or anything like that you might find with other mediums. They're just blended perfectly. I'm just going to add a bit more crimson, a bit more vermilion. So we've got a mixture of the two. And there you go. So whereas the crimson was much pinker, you can see by adding the vermilion it's gone more red, so more like a fire red really. I'm just really impressed with the amount of pigment in these paints. Let's add some more water and see how light we can get our mix, and then I'm gonna try and mix two colours together that are opposites to get a third colour, so a couple of primary colours, see what happens there. So I've added some more water, and there's our very, very light tinted wash. So really, really versatile for, you know, all kinds of different things. You can build up the colour rather than have it bold and vibrant straight away, and there's nothing much you can really do with it. So let's have a go. Let's go with blue and yellow makes green. So I'm going to find a blue and a yellow. So we've got a lemon yellow here, and we've got a cerulean blue. Those two should do, shouldn't they? So just going to add a little bit to my palette. You don't need a lot at all, that's probably too much. So can you imagine how long these are going to last if you only need a very slight bit to get quite a lot of colour? Okay, so we've got our lemon yellow and our cerulean blue. Let's give them a mix. I'm going to take some blue first of all, and then the yellow. So straight away you can see we've got a beautiful green appearing, and you can add more yellow to make it lighter and more blue to make it darker. We all know how to mix colours by now, I'm sure. It's a primary school thing. But it's nice to see that you can do this and create different shades and tones. So even though you've got 60 different colours here, you can just mix and match and keep going with lighter and darker values and create endless tones, really. So there we go, there is a beautiful green wash. Fantastic. I'm going to wash off the brush and see if we can rework this crimson, which has almost dried. Not quite. Maybe let's try the first one then. So I'm going to go in there. See, yeah, you can see that the pigment is spreading. So definitely not waterproof, as I mentioned before. But you can't really rework the original. So you can see that definite kind of line of the swatch is not moving at all, but you are picking up some of the paint. So it lightens the value of the swatch, I guess. Now, if you were to use some tissue to pick up that water, you would have a much lighter patch underneath. Same again with the crimson. So that wasn't quite dry, but you can see that one has actually worked really well to rework. You can't even see the original patch. So I guess the more paint you use rather than water, if you've got a more paint to water ratio, the more you can rework it, I guess. That's what I'm learning here. I hope this isn't boring for you guys or kind of substandard, but this is me just experimenting for the first time, seeing what happens. And I love how that's kind of spider-webbed into the previous bit of water that we put down there. You could create some really nice effects with that. Now, what happens if you wet the paper first? So I'm going to wet the paper. It's still got a little bit of colour in it from the water. Maybe should have got some fresh water. But we've wet the paper. Now let's take a little bit of this blue and see what happens when we put it down on the wet paper. Okay, so can you see the beautiful kind of, it spreads and it spider webs out, and it's absolutely beautiful. So you could create a beautiful sky there. You could add a bit of white. Have we got a white here? We have. We've got a titanium white. So I'm going to put a little bit of that down on my palette. Oh, quite a lot. And I'm going to grab some, and let's try and gradiate this down. So just add a bit more water. It's meant to be a very watery medium, obviously, with it being called watercolour. There's a bit of white there. So that is how I would create a kind of sky scene now. Let's just mix this in a little bit more. There we go. So I love it. I love that. I don't know how it would stand up in colouring books because you're using tons and tons of water. But I think if you were using a really high quality colouring book, and you were just careful about the amount of water you were using, I think they'd be fine. But I love the different effects that you can create with this. Now, obviously, I'm not a professional. There'll be professionals maybe watching who will be just screaming at the screen that I'm doing everything wrong here, but there aren't any wrongdoings in art, surely. That's what I'm telling myself anyway. So that's watercolours. If you've got anything kind of, any other questions or anything you want me to test out, I can always do a follow-up video to this. But just for now, that's my first kind of impression of them, is that they're much more saturated than I thought. And I don't know whether that's the quality of the Arteza pigments and things used, or whether that's just how watercolours are. But I'm sure watercolours I've used in the past just haven't been as vibrant as these. So it's a massive thumbs up for these Arteza ones for sure. Now we're going to move on to the gouache, which is watercolour's closest relative, and see how we do there. Okay, so here we've got the gouache paints. Let's do exactly the same kind of test as we did on the watercolours, so we can have like a comparative look at them. So I'm going to find the crimson, which I used in the previous demo. Where are we? I bet it'll be right at the bottom. Let's see, got one more after this. Yep, right at the bottom. So we've got the crimson red that we used, the vermilion we also used as well, and we used lemon yellow and cerulean blue. There we go. So I'm going to get the same paints out that we used before and see if we can see a difference with these gouache colours. Okay, so starting off with the crimson red, I'm going to pop this down. So I don't know if it's just me or they seem a little more sticky to come out than the watercolours did, which were more fluid. So going to grab some of this. At the moment it's looking pretty much exactly the same as the watercolour did, so let's just do a swatch of that. On camera, aren't I? Yes. Do a swatch of that. Yeah, so pretty comparative really. There's nothing different I can see so far. Let's get a really thick bit of paint on the brush and see how thick it goes. Oh yeah. So this is almost, it's almost too thick. It almost feels like oil. But you can see it's a lot darker, it's a lot thicker, it's leaving strokes rather than melting into the paper. Now I'm going to get a really light wash of it. So I'm going to need to really clean my brush here because there seems to be a ton of pigment in these. And get really light colour and wash that on. So at the moment, in comparison, just to show you, you can see hopefully that the gouache are much darker than the watercolours, but there's really not too much difference in the lighter and the medium kind of tones. It's just that darker one that looks a bit different. I will compare them all at the end so you can see what they look like dry. So next up we added a little bit of vermilion, didn't we? Let's try that. So I'll pop a bit of the orange here and mix that in. Yeah, so this does feel a lot thicker than the watercolour, I must say. It doesn't seem to spread as well on the paper as the watercolour does. I think the watercolour is more of a liquid, more of a fluid medium, whereas this is just that bit thicker, which we've come to expect anyway from what we learn off the internet. So going to take some of that vermilion on its own and see what that looks like. Very, very thick. Really quite dark as well. I'll be interested to see how the colours dry. If they dry darker or lighter than they go down when they're wet. And let's get a really light patch of the orange. See how that looks. So again, you can create various tints, shades and tones. You've got a really good kind of versatility and a range with these. So next up we did the green, so the cerulean blue and the lemon yellow. When it gets to the tempera paints, I'll have to see what we can do that's similar because we don't have as many kind of options with those. Okay, so mixing in the blue and the yellow now. Nothing wrong with the mixing whatsoever. It's going really, really well. There's no residue, there's no weird bits in it that you might find with other mediums that blend, you know, like the pastel. So let's do this, do a nice swatch. Lovely. Nothing you can say about that, is there really? Let's just put a bit more of the colour on it. Yep. Beautiful. Okay. Can you see? I've got a feeling that this video is just sounding way too amateur. I think a 6-year-old might be able to do a better explanation than me. What do we do next? So wet on wet. So I'm going to wet the paper. Still got a little bit of green there from the water. So I've wet the paper. Now I'm going to get some of that blue, and yeah, exactly the same effect as the watercolour, although I would say I don't know as if it's spreading as well as the watercolour did. I guess that's because it's thicker. So I'm going to get that white now. I need the titanium white, which is here. Pop a bit of that on there, see what happens. Yeah, you can definitely tell with this experiment here that we're doing now, the consistency of the paint is completely different to the watercolour. Even though the swatches look quite similar, you can just feel it. It's something I can't really describe unless you're kind of doing it yourself, but you can feel the difference. You can see it doesn't quite merge as well together, and it does have more of a sticky consistency to it. But I guess that's a good thing if you are planning on painting and colouring books. I would probably say try the gouache, because they don't need as much water to be as vibrant and vivid and really show up on the page. So with colouring book pages, you don't really want to be using a lot of water if you can help it. Just going to add a bit more water to this, see if it makes any difference. Maybe a little more blue at the top, just so we've got a comparative example that we can look back on at the end. So I'm really interested to know what you guys think of this. You'll have to let me know in the comments if you've got any experience with any of these mediums, and there's anything you can kind of tell me that I can try as well. Just adding a little bit more white to the bottom. There we go. So I think that will do for a comparison. Let's pop that to one side and go with the acrylics now and see what happens with those. So one little bit that I forgot to do just before we do move on is to see what happens when we try and rework a dry piece. So I'm going over here just with plain water. You can see loads of pigment is coming out of that, loads more than the watercolour did. We're almost getting rid of the edge there as well, so it's reworking really, really well. Might be a bit of a better option if you do want to rework it. Let's try this thicker portion too. Yeah, it almost, when you rework the gouache, it almost makes the consistency of the watercolour as that went down, if that makes sense. So you can definitely tell the medium is much thicker. Okay, let's move on now. Okay, so we've got our acrylics ready to go this time. Starting off with the crimson red. So these larger tubes, possibly because you would use a lot more acrylic over a larger surface than you would use on watercolour paper, because you can use acrylics on any kind of surface really, wood and metal and ceramic and all kinds of things. So I've got this crimson red. Let's just do a kind of moderate amount of water like we've been doing. See how that works out. Okay, so that red looks quite different to the reds that we had in the watercolour and the gouache. It looks darker somehow. I don't know whether it's meant to dry lighter or what, but we will see once it's dry. So I'm going to do a really thick swatch of it now. I'm just grabbing loads of the paint. Yeah, so it kind of goes up in stages. The gouache is thicker than the watercolour, and you can tell that this is thicker than the gouache. And it definitely has a different kind of consistency to it. The colour's completely different, and the way it looks as it's gone onto the paper is completely different. Let's try a very, very light swatch now. Here we go. So very comparable, really. It's just that it does look a bit duller, I think, than the previous ones. Let's add in this vermilion. See what we can do with that. Okay, so firstly we'll add some in with the red and see what we get. So again, it mixes really nicely, nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Looks very, very similar, to be honest, to the colour that we've already put down. Now let's try the vermilion on its own, because that is a much lighter colour, so I'll be interested to see how that compares. Let's get a bit of water in it. There we go. Yeah, again, it's much, much darker. So that's a really valid point, actually. If you're looking for the colours that you use to be exact as they are when they come out of the tube, then I would stick with watercolours and gouache, because I think you would really have to have experience with acrylic to know what colour you're going to get, the hue, because it's just so different. And then we'll do a really light vermilion as well. There we go, so you can get it super, super light. Okay, let's try mixing. I really wish I knew some better techniques to show you if I was more of a prolific painter rather than absolute, well, what's before a beginner? Pre-beginner? Literally no good with paint, but I hope that you'll enjoy this kind of very amateur look at paints. So again, beautiful green straight away, blended absolutely perfectly. Just keep adding bits more blue or yellow to get it the right colour that you want. So it does create a really light wash if you do use a lot of water. I was expecting it to be much, much thicker than it is. Don't get me wrong, it is a thick paint, but I was expecting it to be quite hard to work with, really. The only time I've worked with acrylics is when I'm doing a water wash background. So say I've coloured a page with a mermaid on it, and I wanted to make it look like her bottom half was underwater. That's when I would use a bit of an acrylic wash to make it kind of lighten up, and maybe a little bit of acrylic on the waves. Let me just show you this, hang on. Loads of pencils are going to fall down on me. Okay, so here we go. So you see how I've put acrylic on the water here, so it looks like lapping waves. That's the only real experience I've had with acrylics. So yeah, I was expecting them to act a little bit differently. The thing that's amazed me most is the colour difference, to be honest. Right, let's have a go with the wet and wet. So I'll just wash the brush. Let's get some water on here. Let's grab our blue. Okay, so that's interesting. As soon as I've put it down on the paper, the original strokes have stayed where they are, but you can just see, hopefully, that there is just some feathering immediately that comes out, and it's just very, very light. It creates kind of like a halo around the paint. So that's interesting. But you can see straight away that it's not moving much at all compared to the watercolour that we did. Let's add a bit more water in, see what happens. Of course, look at that massive kind of halo that's gone around it. We need some titanium white now to add in. We're going to keep our experiment all the same. Okay, so you remember what I said about the permanency of acrylics? They cannot be reworked. So you can almost see straight away that there are two halves of this rather than any kind of merging going on. Maybe we can try and just do that with our paintbrush, but not too much happening under there, to be honest. Let's try getting a bit more blue. Interesting. So if you are looking to create a very gradiated, soft wash look, I mean, it doesn't look too bad, don't get me wrong, but I would say that the watercolour or the gouache is a definite choice for that, preference. Let's add a little bit more water. Anything going on? Okay, so there we have it. So that is the acrylic. Of course, we will see what that looks like when it's dry. Just going to do that quick experiment. Now, I don't think that this is going to make a jot of difference, but let's see. Look at that, absolutely nothing coming off that whatsoever. Let's try it with the thicker one, which still might be slightly wet, so we might have a bit of a better result. There you go. So it's still slightly wet, which is why, but you can see that it's really not changing it too much at all. So there we go. Next, we'll move on to the Tempera Paints, and then I'll come back at the end and we'll see what we make of all the dry pieces. Right, so we're here now with the Tempera Paints, or the poster paints, and the only orange that is in this set, which we could replace with our vermilion, is this neon orange. So I don't know how that's going to work out. We're just going to have to wait and see. But first of all, we're starting off with our red, just like we did with the previous colours. So I've just opened it up and I can see on this one that we have a little protective seal over it. So we've got to open that up. And I must say it does look much more of a vermilion colour rather than a true red, this one. So we'll see. So that feels a lot wetter, a lot sloppier. It came out really easily. I think if I'd have squeezed it too much, we would have had paint absolutely everywhere. That's how that feels. So let's give a go with some water first of all. Bearing in mind, you don't have to use water at all with tempera or acrylic paints. You can pretty much just use them as they are. So we will do that as well. So that's with the water. That's really, really washed out, isn't it? It feels quite sticky, it's almost like painting with glue a little bit. Let's try the paint on its own as it's kind of meant to be. Yeah, so it's really, really kind of translucent. I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting it to be more opaque than it is. Let's grab a bit more, just because I really want to see with a lack of water what this looks like. Yeah, even though it's thick and gooey, that's the only way I can describe it, it's still quite translucent. You can still see all of those strokes. It's not as opaque as I thought it was going to be. So that's interesting. Let's do a very, I was going to say let's do a really pale one because that's how we've been doing it, but I think that that's really pale enough. Let's give it a go though. So there's a very kind of pale tint of the colour. But yeah, definitely can tell the difference between this paint and the previous paints. It just doesn't have that kind of artist quality, you can just tell. It definitely feels like a much cheaper medium, which it is, that you would just sort of buy in any kind of shop for your kids to paint with, to be honest. So I said we didn't have a orange, we've got a neon orange though. And again, I've got to take off the seal. So this isn't really a great comparison because we haven't got the exact colours, but with that in mind, we'll do our best. So we're going to mix the red in with the neon orange. Okay, so they mix quite nicely. Let's see what happens. Yeah, again, it's too thin, I think. I was expecting it to be super, super thick, but it's just very, very thin. It's not like the Tempera Paint that I remember at school. I don't know whether it's just a different formulation or what, but there's a little bit of water on it. There we go. So just the coverage, I think, the coverage is just nowhere near what you would expect from an artist paint. But of course, we cannot judge it by artist paints because they're not artist paints. Okay, so next we're going to do a bit of a mix. I keep forgetting I've got to do the seals every time. There we go, bit of a mix. Oh, Don't know if that's out of camera. No, it's not. You can see it. I've just got blue all over my desk, but they are super washable, so that's good. And then the yellow. So, you know, maybe if you're practicing painting in your colouring books with your watercolour or your acrylic or whatever, and you've got your kids wanting to help, this would definitely be a good, inexpensive choice so that they feel like they're painting with mom or dad. So there we've got our two colours together. Let's mix them in. Interested to see how these mix actually. It's funny, they just don't seem like they have a lot of substance, if that makes sense. They look really thick, but they don't feel it. So there is our green mix. Let's put this down. Yeah, just very dull, very desaturated. But again, you're not really, well, I'm not saying you're not meant to, you can do what you like, but you're not really supposed to use water with poster paints. So maybe if we just do another little test, I'll completely dry off my brush. So that's completely dry now. Pick up the paint only with no water, mix that together. I'm very conscious of trying to apply methods to things that don't, you know, they're not meant for that purpose. So there's just with the paint itself, but it's still really desaturated, still really translucent. So there we go. Right, what's next? The wet on wet. So I'm gonna wet all of this paper. I've got a nice patch of water there, and I'm going to take some blue, which I need more of. It seems to, seem to need more than you did with the others. So here's the blue. So I think what it feels like to me is that there's a lot more binders and additives in this paint rather than pigment. And that's just what's screaming out to me really, because it just seems to stick together and not really want to do anything. So let's get some white. Oh, nearly poured it on as it was then. It was white everywhere. Okay, let's pop some there. And as little as water as possible, just grab some white. See what blend we can achieve. Okay, so it's not too bad. You know, as I say, if your children were colouring and painting and they wanted to try and blend some colours and make a little gradiated sky, I think they'd be fairly happy with that, to be honest. But it also feels like it would take a little while to dry because it's just so watery and goopy. It's the only way I can describe it, really. But there we have it. There's our acrylic experiment. Very, very different to the previous paints we've used, which come to be expected, really. It's not an artist paint. So just going over this dry patch here. Bit of colour coming off, but nothing major. Obviously, this is still really, really wet, so it's not going to make much difference. It's just basically using the paint as it was when it went down. But there we are. So that is the acrylic. Now, no, it's not the acrylic. It's the tempera. Tempera. Okay, so I'm going to wait for all of these samples to dry now, and then I'm going to come back to you, compare them when they're dry, see what they look like, they feel like, if they're chalky or glossy or what have you, and we will finish our experiment there and conclude what findings, what little findings we've experienced on this experiment. So I'll be back with you very shortly. So while I was waiting for the others to dry, I thought that I might try acrylic and tempera paint on standard paper. So this is the kind of paper that goes through your printer at work, just bog standard, very thin copy paper. Because I thought some of you more seasoned artists might start shouting at me saying you need to try different papers because they're not meant to just go on watercolour like the watercolour paints and the gouache paints are. So I've tried them on the cheaper copy paper and they're not quite dry yet, as you can see, but what I've noticed is that the acrylics do seem a lot bolder and more vibrant on the copy paper than they did on the watercolour paper. So if I just show you side by side here, you can see that the exact same colour of the crimson red, it looks a lot duller and desaturated and just not as bright and vibrant as it does on the copy paper here. Same again really with the vermilion and of course the green. Just look at the difference in that green. So what I've done is I've mixed the yellow and blue together on this side, made it really, really thick, and then I've added water and washed it out so that you could see how that looks. And it really does make a huge difference to paper that you're using them on. So I would recommend that if you want to use acrylics, try using them on your colouring books, any paper that doesn't have that kind of tooth or weight to it that watercolour has for absorbing and things like that. So try that first before you discount acrylics, because you can see the difference. So they look really, really good on just standard paper, and that's without kind of any water at all apart from this wash bit here. So again, something you can use in your colouring books without having to use a ton of water and buckle the pages. Then I tried the tempera and unlike the acrylic, we're not seeing a huge amount of difference here, to be honest. You can see pretty much exactly the same as the sample that we did. They're very wishy-washy. You can see every single stroke you've made with the brush, and yeah, so tempera are as bad on pretty much any paper. But again, they're not meant to be artist paints, they're meant to be for kids, and they're really bold, they're really colourful, so kids will absolutely love them. So I'm going to come back now with the previous 4 that we did. I know that these tempera aren't dry yet, as you can see, but they are taking an age to dry, so that's another thing you might want to factor in. So we've got the acrylic next door, we have got the gouache, and we've got the watercolour. So let's first of all compare the watercolour and the gouache, because I can't fit them all on the screen at the same time. So these two together. To be honest with you, there is not a lot of difference between them at all. There probably would be if you were painting landscape or a scene and you wanted to create a certain effect, a certain look. Maybe then you would notice more of a difference, but this is purely just from a swatching perspective. You can see that they're pretty much the same. The gouache are slightly deeper in colour, especially you can see here with the crimson red, you can see the blue on the wash is just a lot deeper, but I don't think that they blend as well wet on wet as watercolour do, which obviously they're made for. Again, the watercolour is still slightly wet, just in areas where it seems to have pooled. But they are a lot quicker drying than the tempera for sure. I would say that you could use either of these in colouring books, but I'd just be really careful. Obviously, watercolour paints aren't really meant to be used on standard paper. They're supposed to have this kind of paper that can take the medium, take the water, and also they don't absorb them quickly, so you can rework them and things like that. But as for differences between watercolour and gouache, I would say that the gouache are marginally more vibrant. They're probably easier to work with than watercolour because you can decide how thick you want them. But again, as for pigments and being someone that isn't experienced in either medium, I would say these Arteza paints are super, super high quality. I was not expecting to get as much pigment and vividity out of the watercolours as I did here, especially reading about how opaque and thin and transparent they are. So, you know, if you are looking for that kind of watercolour, maybe these need to be watered down a lot more than your standard watercolours. I don't really know, but you'll know by looking at these as professionals. So next we have those acrylics and temperas. Tempera, don't know. And you can see, obviously, the tempera is not dry yet. But on this kind of paper, I wouldn't rate either, to be honest. I would say, though, that the acrylics obviously aren't meant to be used on watercolour paper, or at least they don't perform to their best on watercolour paper. Tempera perform the same everywhere. But obviously the difference is that you can use acrylics on all kinds of different surfaces and they will dry permanent, whereas the tempera, you can just add a splash of water and they're just going to ruin themselves. So again, if you're looking to use acrylics because you want that permanency, I would definitely say the paper really matters. And this time it's the other way around. This time you need a very cheap, kind of thin, paper that is just going to absorb the colour straight away, and it doesn't have any kind of properties that the watercolour paper has. So with all that being said, what do you think? Please let me know in the comments whether this video has been a huge bore or whether you've learnt a bit more maybe than you knew before. I certainly have. I definitely know now the differences between the feel of the paints, but I guess you can only really know when you've used them yourself. Now, I did say at the start of this video that all of these paints come in smaller sets, so if you are wanting to do your own little experiment and try all 4 of these out together, you can go to the Arteza website, links below, and you can grab the smaller sets of these paints just to give yourself a feel for them before you dive right in with a massive 60 set. But if you do watercolouring, if you do gouache painting, and you are adept with the medium, I would definitely say that the Arteza products are fantastic quality, really, really are. The level of vibrancy, as I say, I was not expecting at all, and they lay down beautifully. Acrylics, temperas, acrylics definitely need to be used on this kind of non-absorbent paper, whereas the temperas, I think you should just stick to giving those to your kids to do some finger painting, to be fair. But yes, please let me know if you've enjoyed it. Please give me a thumbs up, even if you thought it was a load of rubbish, because it will make me feel better than seeing a lot of dislikes. But anyway, let me know in the comments if you have any more questions about these mediums. If you do, I may do a follow-up video testing out anything you want me to test out and things like that. So thank you very, very much for watching, and I will see you soon on Colour with Claire.